Hello, Design Outlook. I've always wanted to feel like Madonna or a wrestler, and I feel like I've just killed two birds with one stone. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land in which we meet today, the peoples of the Wurundjeri and the Kulin Nation. I also want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today, we're here to rediscover creativity, connect as an industry, and celebrate our craft. Welcome to Why Your Product Team Needs a Dungeon Master. My name's Pete, and I'm a design manager at Block. I'm very lucky to be in the position I am. I get to work with a world-class cohort of designers, and I get to work towards building a more equitable economy for all. I love supporting cross-functional teams, but what I love more than that is the storytelling process behind how we build products and services for people. It's not kind of weird to say, well, where did this all begin? During the height of the COVID pandemic, I, like most people, found myself with ample amounts of free time. What was I to do? I could have learned a new language. Perhaps I even developed a healthier lifestyle. Hey, you know what? I could have adopted a pet, or maybe I wanted to fly some students to Austin. Instead, these were all too big a commitment. Those who have gotten slacks from me know my struggles with English, so learning another language wasn't on the table. And I've been known to put pot plants in cupboards, so I'm not quite ready to progress to pet dad. Instead, I did the only thing a young professional could. I chose to spend hundreds of hours on YouTube watching Dungeons and Dragons campaigns. Hundreds of hours. I developed this obsession watching groups of people play virtual Dungeons and Dragons. Essentially, I watched 5 people sitting in a group call, creatively solving their way out of problems. Sound familiar? For those of you who've never watched Stranger Things, let me give you a quick introduction to the world of Dungeons and Dragons. It's essentially the crossroads between improv and fantasy. Players in the game form a party and usually sit around a table or jump in a Zoom call. A party is made up of players taking on a persona of a character, and each one of these characters have potential strengths and weaknesses. With each character possessing their own unique strengths and weaknesses, they adventure together through the dangerous and the unknown, discovering more and more about the world around them. They fight dragons, explore cursed dungeons, and conquer terrible enemies in all shapes and sizes. Once their foes have been defeated, they're usually rewarded in gold, riches, and magical items. These rewards fuel future adventures, and a single campaign can last for years and years on end. There's another player in this game, and it's called a Dungeon Master. They don't play a playable character, but they're tasked with creating the worlds, quests, and adventures for their party. They create maps, checkpoints, even sometimes entire political systems, just for their players to navigate and explore. They give agency to their teams to make decisions and deliver the consequences. They do all this without telling their players what to do or how to do it. Today, we're going to explore what makes Dungeon Masters the ideal facilitators of adventure in even the darkest of dungeons. This is actually a nice little segue into our quest this evening. How might we slay dysfunctional teams? Dysfunctional teams have a couple of key giveaways. They can be identified by random calls that trigger your fight or flight response, Slack messages that are left on red, and ego-driven differences of opinion that make you feel more like a politician than a designer. Dysfunctional teams are the bane of any designer's existence. Dysfunctional teams are a detriment to the psychological safety of everyone. They damage our sense of status, autonomy, fairness. They leech the joy from our work, and they inhibit us from being great cross-functional team members. When designers are embedded within a cross-functional team, it limits our voice. So when we find ourselves within dysfunctional teams, it makes it harder to practice our craft to the fullest. And it's fair as an industry if we take a step back and ask ourselves the question, why do we even have dysfunctional teams? For an industry and discipline whose defining trait is empathy, for a discipline that views friction as opportunity, if your team is dysfunctional, you've failed as a designer. With the skills and tools that we have as designers, our team should just be a reflection of our success. If we don't look inward and understand how our tools can be used within our teams, then what hope do we have in affecting the lives of our users? To celebrate the highs of design without owning any of the lows does us a disservice. But that's okay. Failure is a part of design. And lucky for you, I found the antidote in Dungeons and Dragons. Today, we're going to step through 3 essential tools that Dungeon Masters use based on my time observing, interviewing some of the best Dungeon Masters on the planet. These are people with over 20 years experience facilitating these games. We'll then take a look at those elements and see how we can use them to solve the core problems of our dysfunctional teams. There are 3 key lessons that we can take away, and they're going to form the basis of our quest this evening. In part 1, we're going to talk about how Dungeon Masters equip their party for success. In part 2, we're going to talk about owning the entire story from end to end and what that means as a product designer. And one thing that Dungeon Masters do is they love the uncreative stuff. They love the boring stuff. By the end of this session, we should all be fully equipped to morph even the most dysfunctional of teams. So let's begin our quest. Players make or break your campaign, so let's set them up for success. We're going to define what a party is and how that relates to a simple cross-functional team. We're also going to learn to evaluate our team makeup. And we're going to use those learnings to reflect on how we level up our teams. I went out and interviewed a bunch of D&D players as well, essentially asking for quotes where a party has wiped. And a party wipe is when every adventurer fails. They all die. And when they all die, the campaign ends because no one's left to continue the story. With no one survivor, this is probably a detrimental experience. Oh, sorry. These quotes actually came from dysfunctional product teams. When either a cross-functional team or a party is under-equipped, we're going to have a harder time saving the day. A D&D party is essentially a cross-functional team. We trade quests for OKRs. We trade gold for performance reviews. But ultimately, we're working together with a pool of cross-talented individuals that enhance our own singular abilities, gaining communal experiences through the products we launch, maintain, and grow. In our world, we're not surrounded by wizards, paladins, or mages, but by professions from a mix of different disciplines that come together to create cross-functional teams. Ideally, in both situations, we aim to belong to a group of people whose strengths uplift each other's weaknesses. In Dungeons and Dragons, a Dungeon Master's first task is to evaluate the makeup of those strengths and weaknesses. In a campaign, players can choose roles ranging from shape-shifting magic wielders to barbarians who just smash and plunder their way through glory. So it's important that a team is well-balanced enough so that they are ready for success. A successful party is one with complementary skills and unique traits. But conflict can kind of arise when you don't have the necessary skills. Have you thought about multiclassing? A simple question with immeasurable impact. Multiclassing is how we instill the value of design into our cross-functional partners and the secret to leveling up our teams. On the left here, we have an example of how a party is made up between a druid, a mage, and a paladin. All classes with their unique traits, defining strengths and characteristics. Druids have the ability to turn into animals and harness the nature around them. Mages can't do that, but they can cast spells, inflict major damage, and build the perception of reality. Paladins can't do that, but they're godly knights that wield the power of their god, using faith and gut instinct alone to inform their decisions. On the right, we can take the same view of how we kind of visualize a simple cross-functional team. I'm not going to say 3 in the box, because that's another presentation, but instead of paladins, we have product managers. While there are many differences between these 2 teams, one thing is consistently the same, and that's trust. A foundation in trust in each other's roles and responsibilities. The problem, however, with these teams is that issues fall through the cracks. And we've all been in situations like this. Something was overlooked, an AC wasn't captured, we thought something was written down when it really wasn't. The list goes on and on and on. And the catch-all phrase seems to say, it's no one's fault. But in reality, that's just another way of saying we're all at fault. So how can multiclassing help your team? In D&D, multiclassing allows a player to create a character with not just one set of defining attributes, but 2. It allows a fighter to cast spells like a mage, and suddenly players don't have to compromise on the skills they deem to be the most important. In product, though, it's not that easy. We have very particular roles that can take years and sometimes a lifetime to master. In product teams, distributed accountability and ownership is the single most effective tool in bringing people together. It helps to build an impenetrable wall for any issue. To foster meaningful relationships and connections around the work, people have to feel a sense of agency and ownership of its success. Accountability and ownership help to form a shared purpose for teams that pave the way for true cross-functional collaboration. And you can achieve this by establishing design as a shared value. Sometimes it's visual, other times you want to focus on the emotional core of it. When our team champions the collective success of design, we no longer need to compromise as designers. When design becomes a shared value, everybody wins. Distributed accountability and ownership is the equivalent of giving your teams a magical weapon. As designers, your ability to instill pride for design will see them flourish. Equip our teams with a love of design. And if you're in a Dungeon Master is asking you, well, how do we introduce distributed accountability and ownership for design? It's a good thing we're moving on to part 2. Own the story, not the chapter. We've equipped our party with the tools they need for success, so what's next? If we're learning to walk, we focus on taking one step at a time. But if we want to run, we have to keep our eyes on the horizon. Owning the story can help you build team agency while giving us the most impact over our future. We're going to explore how the visual elements of design can translate into real, tangible influence. We're also going to learn how we can optimize that influence within our teams. We're also going to talk a bit about pixels. Design is the most fun, but often has the most scrutiny because it's the most visual. With most of our core deliverables being some sort of visual output, people are going to have a view, pardon the pun. The view can come in the form of a critique, feedback, or just sometimes an offhanded comment that can catch you by surprise. Use design's visual identity to your advantage. As designers, we have the opportunity to make space within our teams and give our team members agency over the parts of the process that don't matter so we can focus on what does, the story. Own the story. Don't stress the pixels. In one of my interviews, I asked the Dungeon Master about one of the most surprising things his group of adventurers did. A large content creator contacted him on Twitch and wanted him to plan out a couple of D&D sessions. So he spent weeks planning this campaign, backstories of every non-playable character, side quests, the political landscape of this small little shanty town, really the most detail you could ever get. The campaign centered around this magical glass orb with immeasurable power. And in the first party, it's the big unveil, and he takes it out in front of 2,000 live viewers, and he gives it to the party. After investigating it for a while, they asked, can we break it? They chose to throw it on the ground. The orb shattered, leaving the DM to pick up the pieces of the campaign. And there's an important lesson here for us as designers. All the planning and attention to detail in the world is wasted unless we understand the core drivers of our users. This quote came from that same Dungeon Master. I don't care what my players do, I care about the why. Perfection is a myth. Spending mountains of time on pixel perfection is a waste. Don't get me wrong, they're intrinsically important to design, but leverage the tools so that pixels don't define your craft. We are more than just the dots on the screen. Design systems have given us all the breath to step back and focus on what the most important thing is, the user. Your ability to leverage scalable systems to more efficiently impact the lives of our customers. As much as we tell ourselves that design is a science, and we can argue about type, color, signifiers, the focus we assign to our craft is a reflection of how others perceive our value. If we only have checkpoints around pixel craft, we're effectively telling our team that's all we care about. We need to stop viewing pixels as justification for our role. We need to recognize them as a tool for cross-functional influence. They allow team members to see the personification of their words on a screen. And that power is phenomenal. The trade-off between UI and the horizon is a no-brainer. If you're searching ways to develop distributed accountability, start with what people can see. With the world embracing AI, our role of design is going to change in the near future. Designers who work with the whole story in mind are going to be better prepared than those who fuss over just the pixels. View them as the tools of influence they are. Personify the voice of your team so they can feel a sense of ownership. Because that's the only way you're going to get through to these. Stakeholders. I'm proud of that one. Share more than just the process with your team. We should stop thinking about ourselves as these two-dimensional transactional team members that feed data into a magical design process just to output some screens or visual documentation. We should view ourselves as a system that brings people together to co-create meaningful impact. Sometimes that will mean co-designing a workshop, but other times it means giving life to ideas that aren't 100%, just so we can learn. Pixels lead to data, and we should be intentional around them from cradle to grave. Optimizing your influence means using the tools at your disposal. Use the dots to leverage your reach across the entire experience, not just the single page or screen. As we do grow as an industry and start establishing ourselves as strong cross-functional leaders, it will inherently bring with it a level of detachment from pixels, but never product quality. We will always be judged by the quality of our work, pixels and all. While much of the industry might just define us as deliverables and pixels, it doesn't mean we have to. While inherent to the fundamentals of design, our craft is shifting to value-enhanced collaboration and leadership throughout the unknown. Our craft will expand cross-functionally, and your ability to co-create and co-write the story of your products will be weighted higher than any other skill. Being a good cross-functional leader doesn't mean you don't care about the pixels, it just means you care more about the story. Because if you don't, stuff like this happens. When solutions rule context, design suffers. Attachment to solutions and pixels over story leads to dystopia. It's okay to sacrifice the pixels to prioritize your team's story. Own the story, not just the chapter. Part 3, love the uncreative. We can only do the most rewarding parts of our role if we've had to do the most boring. The same concept might exist for Dungeon Masters. To close, we're going to have a look at that in a little bit more detail. We're going to question, is that entirely true? We're then going to ask if creativity equates to inspiration. We're also going to touch on a couple of really uncreative elements of design. Like design, being a Dungeon Master is commonly misunderstood. It's easy to be a Dungeon Master because they just have fun, right? They get to do all the visual stuff. They get to design the stories and the maps. They have all the visual elements. Surely it's just a really creative role. It's a lot of the airy-fairy work. These are just a couple of screenshots of gold economy tables used for Dungeons and Dragons. It's actually a soft prerequisite of being an accredited economist before stepping into this world. There is an exhaustive list of constraints in D&D. What we're looking at here is just several of the rulebooks combined together. Amazing Dungeon Masters know the rules. They're able to use them as constraints to elicit the most creative problem solving from their party. Boring stuff usually lays the foundation for the most creative. It's easy to confuse creativity with inspiration. There's a pressure we often feel as designers to be the creative one, the one who thinks outside the box or has that 1 in a million idea. And when the bar is set that high, it's okay if we pivot it. On the one hand, creativity is seeing opportunities within the noise, but on the other, it could be as simple as creating an epic spreadsheet or writing an inspirational Jira ticket. And that's totally okay. The reality is, we do a lot of boring stuff in design. It unlocks the fun parts. I spent last week working on a spreadsheet, VLOOKUPs and everything. It was actually a work of beauty, but creative? I used to describe design as a risk mitigation tool. A risk mitigation tool. How do we help businesses launch products that people love? Translation of which is, how do we spend engineering time building things that are going to make us money? It sounds like the most painfully uncreative thing I've ever said, but it makes sense because we creatively empower teams to build things that are easy to use as cheaply as possible. That's our core function and value to businesses, so we should own it. We help teams creatively build the right thing at the right time, the right way for the right people, so we don't waste anything. A love of the boring unlocks the joys from our craft. Design has the opportunity to inspire a shared sense of ownership of the products and services we tender. When we think about creativity and design, we're usually colored by just the parts that people can see. Try and bring people into your process and expose them to the parts that they can't. The visibility of design helps get our eyeballs on work, but if we're only celebrating the pixels, our team members won't see the true value of design. If we all channel our inner Dungeon Masters, there's no reason we should ever find ourselves within a dysfunctional team for long. They just need the tools for success, a direction to adventure, and a love of the boring parts. Before you know it, you'll be leveling up your team with the skills of a Dungeon Master. Thank you.